Perfect. So you're all very welcome again this evening. This is our third session of Uniquely Wonderful, an Intro to Autism. And today we'll be talking all about communication. And for this week's presentation, I have the help of Sabrina Browne, who is a speech and language therapist. So Sabrina collaborated with me on most of these slides. And today's session will be particularly helpful to you if your child has been diagnosed recently or if you're awaiting an assessment and communication or social skills was mentioned a lot during that procedure, or if you have any concerns regarding communication, whether it's socializing or just your child being able to advocate for what they want. So, tiny little recap from last week. It was all about supporting a child that has behaviours that challenge and really what to do to help a child who is anxious or in distress. And I think the main takeaway from last week was that behaviour is the tip of the iceberg. And as parents and carers and as adults in general, we need to shift our lens view so that beneath every behaviour is an unmet need or an unrealistic expectation on behalf of the adult in the situation. And we spoke a lot last week and the week before about how we see behaviours that challenge when a child is not able to communicate or their needs are not met. So that is part of the reason why communication is a really important topic to discuss when we're talking about a child with additional needs. The person that's able to communicate can advocate for their needs, get what they want to survive and to thrive. And that's why we discuss communication around the kids that we support. So like I said, today's presentation was developed with the assistance of Sabrina Browne, and she is a speech and language therapist. If anyone has a bit of confusion over what a speech and language therapist does, I'm sure you're not on your own, and we're going to explain that in detail this evening. And the hope will be that after this presentation, you will feel more empowered as a parent or as a carer the next time you are working with a speech and language therapist or meeting with an SLT. So just to start off, what exactly is communication? Communication is how a message, meaning, or thought is conveyed. It's literally the act of conveying meanings from one entity or group to another using mutually understood signs, symbols, and semiotic rules. So we know that communication isn't just a two-way street. It's not from a parent to a child, a teacher to a child. It can involve groups, it can involve individuals. We can communicate with people across the globe. It does not have to be verbal. You don't have to be standing in front of somebody. So there could literally be people listening in on this session from all over the world tonight, and we can still communicate effectively. Communication, like I said, occurs between two or more individuals, entities, or groups. And communication can be broken down into three different forms, which we all use. Every person uses these three different forms throughout their daily life. Verbal communication, which is what instantly comes to mind when we think about speech and language or communication. That's what we speak, what comes out of our mouth. Non-verbal communication is the really big one. So things like body language, facial expressions, eye contact, tone of voice, and gesture. We don't often think about this form of communication because it tends to come very natural to humans. And also be aware that there is intentional body language. So things like our eye contact, our gestures, but there's also unintentional body language. If a person is nervous, they may start sweating, their skin can get red, they may get a bit fidgety, and those are behaviors that they have no control over, and yet they're communicating something about that person's internal state of being. And also we have written communication, the written words, sentences or symbols and pictures. And different studies have shown that about 70 to 93% of information is conveyed non-verbally. And yet we are all very, very anxious and worried if our child is not developing verbal communication at the rate that we think might be typical. It can be a great concern for parents and carers. So even though we rely so much on non-verbal communication, verbal communication is massively important, and we are right to be worried and anxious about that. But just to let you know, there are many, many forms of communication. So before we really get started today, let's think about all the different ways we've communicated so far. So there's probably too many to name. So I know, for example, I got up and I spoke to the people I share my home with. I used verbal speech and non-verbal communication through my facial expressions, eye contact, and gestures. So things like, when somebody's on a phone call, you give them the internationally recognized cup of tea symbol, nodding your heads, a wave, or things like that. Then there was lots of work phone calls. So I was using verbal speech, intonation, the cadence of my voice. Text message and email, that was written communication, reading news articles on my phone, watching a YouTube tutorial to learn how to use different features on Zoom. And then, of course, the presentation this evening where I'm communicating and I am delivering a message to everyone who's sitting in this evening, but I can also communicate with you by reading the chat box. You can unmute yourself and I can hear you. So that's just, again, it's the tip of the iceberg. There are so many different ways that we communicate that we are often even not aware of. And it can be hard to actually decide what makes a good communicator. So, effectively, if you are attending this presentation this evening, you're interested in learning what you can do for your child to empower them to be a good communicator. And a good communicator is a very nebulous, vague phrase. There's no one size fits all for a good communicator, and context is really, really key. So in a corporate setting at work, clear, confident, and direct communication is considered effective. But in an interpersonal setting, so if you're chatting with your friends or reading a storybook before bed, a more relaxed, empathetic, and considered communication is best. And if you went into the office and spoke like you were reading a story to a child, chances are that wouldn't be very effective. And examples of good communicators are going to be very personal and very individual to everyone, to different people. And I was trying to think of universally accepted examples of good communicators, and I couldn't really find any that would be like universally accepted, because like I said, it's such a personal thing and it's quite a charged thing as well, because there is some kind of, I suppose, bias when we think of communication. So some of the examples that I thought that I personally liked were David Attenborough, Greta Thunberg, Barack Obama, and Fred Rogers. So I consider them all to be great communicators, but people might have very different opinions than I do. And for example, what exactly makes a good communicator? So politicians are often used as an example of both poor and very, very good communicators. So one man's very stable genius is another man's sore loser. And one person may be rage tweeting at 3 a.m. in the morning, but if that message is getting out to 88.7 million followers, is that person a good communicator? It's kind of a difficult question. There's a lot of different interpretations into what makes a good communicator. And for the purposes of this evening's presentation, I want to get you to kind of get used to thinking about autistic and non-autistic communication as two separate yet connected entities. Autistic people do not have impaired communication, they actually just communicate differently. So the same as if you were in a different country where they did not speak English, you wouldn't say that they were impaired English communicators, you would just accept that they communicate differently. Communication between people with and without autism is a two-way process. While there may be some communication challenges, non-autistic people can do more to meet halfway by accepting differences. So particularly for children and teenagers with their peers, sometimes communication between non-autistic and autistic people can sometimes be a little bit stilted or awkward. And a lot of those issues or challenges can disappear if people are just more considerate of differences. So as non-autistic people, we should accept all forms of communication: verbal, facial expressions, written, symbols, gestures, and typed. I have known a lot of autistic adults who communicate verbally nearly all of the time, but if they're very tired, particularly stressed, or having a particularly difficult day, they may feel more comfortable communicating over text or writing down their communication. And it's also very important to remember that what a non-autistic person might consider rude is not necessarily the case for an autistic person. So lack of eye contact, a person moving and fidgeting while they're talking to us, disinterest in small talk or even in conversation is not actually rude for an autistic person. And we are putting our own non-autistic scope on their form of communication when we call it rude. So things like echolalia, which we learned in the first session, is the repetition of out of context phrases, focusing on a favorite topic, and seemingly unusual or out of context phrases are all forms of communication. And a lot of autistic people are really comfortable with those forms of communication. And just so we can think a little bit more about the context and the environment that we communicate in, it's worth remembering that every country, every society has a different standard for what's considered appropriate, polite, or rude. So burping after a large meal, that's considered a compliment in some Eastern cultures, including Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Tipping is offensive in Japan, whereas in America, you would be a social pariah if you didn't tip. Slurping your food while you eat it is considered a compliment in China. The OK symbol is offensive in Germany, South America, and Turkey. And in some Middle Eastern cultures, showing the soles of your feet is really offensive. So our standards for what we consider to be polite and appropriate are not necessarily the same standards throughout the world. And we can think the same way when it comes to people who have a different neuropathy than us. So their brains work differently. So obviously they're going to have different communication and different social skills. So when we're looking at communication in general, there are a number of prerequisite skills that are required for good communication. And this is the communication tree, which is a tool that's used by speech and language therapists to identify areas that need support or skills that need to be developed. And you'll notice that the communication tree is fairly heavy on the verbal language. So it doesn't really take into account as much the nonverbal and the written forms that we talked about. But a lot of these skills are, if not necessarily, then helpful when it comes to good communication. So you'll see down at the bottom of the trunk, the skills develop at the bottom and they move their way up. So each one of the stages is needed to be secure before the person is able to move up the tree. So they work on the skills and they move up as they get better. If there's a delay in acquiring a skill at one stage, then there might be delays in the skills higher up. So for example, if a young person has difficulty with their attention and listening, then chances are they may have difficulty using sentences in language later on in life. If they have issues with words, they may struggle with grammar. So communication, language, and speech is quite a complex area of learning for everyone, whether you're a child or an adult, or if you're learning a new language. But it's worth working on the basic foundational skills if you want to help your child have effective communication. So again, like I said, the communication tree pretty much focuses exclusively on that verbal speech, but we can't discount the validity and the importance of nonverbal communication. So whether your child has verbal language or not, they are still effectively going to be able to communicate with you. So this is just a useful tool if you are working with a speech and language therapist, or if you're just at home and you are struggling to identify where to start, where are the areas that my child actually needs support and assistance with. So it might be worth actually, printing out this and going through and say, okay, well, how is my child's attention, for their age, for their level of development? Are they able to attend? How is their vocabulary? Do they have words? When they engage in play, are they using language? And then as you go up the tree, the skills get a little bit more complex. So what exactly does a speech and language therapist do? So if your child has been assessed or you're awaiting a diagnosis, chances are you've either met a speech and language therapist or you've been referred to a speech and language therapist. So this is from the Irish Association of Speech and Language Therapists. If you've always wanted to know, but you've been too afraid to ask, and I totally understand that. I think I've been working years in multidisciplinary teams before I actually stopped and said, okay, well, what does an SLT do? And what does an OT do? Like, on paper, what is the basis of their role? So an SLT, or speech and language therapist, is a qualified individual who works with clients that present with communication difficulties. Therapists usually work in a community clinic, school or hospital or special needs setting, but you can also hire speech and language therapists privately. They assess, diagnose and treat clients for a variety of disorders, including childhood speech and language disorder, stammers, acquired speech and language disorders, such as from a brain injury or a disease, voice disorders, eating, drinking, and swallowing difficulties. And speech and language therapists also work with clients who can't communicate effectively through normal means, and they help them to develop appropriate alternative forms of communication, such as specialized computer devices. So in the context of an autistic child, you may have known, okay, speech and language therapist is used to improve vocabulary, pronunciation, speech, their social skills and things like that. But it came as quite a surprise to me that a speech and language therapist is also qualified to work with eating, drinking and swallowing disorders. So if you have a child that has difficulties with certain textures of food, if they have swallowing food or tablets, a speech and language therapist can be a valuable person to work with in that regard. And importantly as well, if a child is actually pre-verbal or non-verbal, they can work with speech and language therapist to learn to use devices that allow for communication. So we're going to learn a little bit more about those specialized computer devices in a couple of minutes. So what is the role of the parent when it comes to developing speech and language and in communication? So again, the responsibility is being put squarely on the shoulder of the parents again, just like last week. But it does make sense that when you spend most of your time with your child, you're the adult that's most present in their life, and they really, they're modeling their behavior on yours, that you would have a pretty big role when it comes to their development overall. Parents and carers are often the first to identify a difficulty or delay. And, I hear it a lot when I'm talking to parents. Often a child is the first child, maybe even the first grandchild in a family, and a parent doesn't notice that a child may have a delay or a difficulty, maybe until the child's in play school or creche or even primary school. And often parents talk about the guilt that they experience or they feel. And I just want to say, there's absolutely no reason to feel that guilt. Your child is your child, and you've done the right thing by treating them just like a member of your family. And as a child, you weren't looking out for any flaws or anything like that. And don't feel guilty if it was a professional or a teacher that has approached you and suggested that there may be some delays. Parent-child attachment is the basis for communication development, absolutely. So the child is basically, watching you like a hawk every minute of the day, and their relationship with you and how closely attached and attuned they feel with you is really important for their development, including speech, language, and social skills. And the amount and type of language that we use in the home affects our language development. Parents and carers are the strongest model of communication for a child. And you'll know the phrase monkey see, monkey do. The more that we model good behaviors, the more our child will be more likely to engage in those behaviors. So if we model each of the skills in the communication tree every day in conversations with and around your child, that is the best thing that you can do to teach your child communication. Literally just communicate as you normally would. Make sure that you're hitting all of those different skills. If you notice that your child is struggling in one area, then maybe you want to have a little bit more of a considered effort, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. Normal communication between the people in the family and the home should be enough during if your child is not currently receiving supports, there may be areas that you identify that you would really like to focus on, but in general, just communication between the people in the home does an amazing job for the kids who are observing. So I want to talk a little bit about attention and listening, which was one of the prerequisite skills for communication. And attention describes a person's ability to concentrate on one activity or one topic whilst they filter out background information. So things like noise, lights, people, smells, tastes. And let's remember that a lot of autistic children can have a sensory processing disorder. So asking them to be able to filter out really strong sensory input can be a lot more challenging than we might think. So traditionally, we might think when someone's paying attention, they're sitting or standing still and they're facing the source of information. So the TV, the teacher, the parent, the radio, whatever it is, they're being quiet and they're listening. They're not speaking, reading, or engaging in other tasks. And they're ready to engage, respond, and to answer questions. So herein lies some of the trouble when we expect neurodiverse and autistic children to pay attention to like that. We're already setting ourselves up for failure, because the traditional non-autistic expectation for paying attention will lead to misunderstandings and miscommunication between people with and without autism. So if we are looking for those signs in our child, but that's not how they pay attention, what we're actually probably teaching the child is to mask or to mimic those behaviors, when really they're putting all their effort and energy into sitting still and being quiet. They're not actually listening to what's being said to them, and they're not learning. And I've had it described before. An autistic adult said he was in school and he would fidget, he would flap his hands, and the teacher was quite old school and said, you have to sit down, you sit on those hands. If you're moving, you're not listening, you're not paying attention in my class. So the child would sit on their hands like this. And then all of a sudden, all of their focus and attention and energy was in the process of sitting on their hands and trying to keep quiet and ignore the awful feeling of energy building up in them. And how they described it, it was like a balloon with the air keep pushing in and expanding, and the air had nowhere to go. So the balloon was going to pop and the child was going to have a meltdown. So if we are expecting our child to pay attention in the traditional sense, that's going to lead to disappointment for everyone. So think about your child. How do they actually pay attention? Are they moving around the room? Or do they have one ear cocked towards you? Are they singing and talking to themselves? You know best if your child is paying attention. Just be open-minded to different forms of paying attention. And again, another example, I remember not too long ago, actually before the pandemic, part of my work brought me into an ASD unit in a school in Galway. And what we were doing was we were working with musicians, actors and puppeteers to put on this multi-sensory show with loads of music and puppets and beautiful interaction. And every time we would go in, there'd be maybe 6 kids in the classroom in total. And generally 4 out of the 6 children would be really engaged, up close and personal, interacting with the puppets. And then we might have 1 or 2 children that would be maybe on the outskirts, and always one of those 2 children would be up and pacing around the room, walking in circles, walking from wall to wall. And they weren't stopping, sitting, watching, looking, or engaging like some of the other children. But we would notice that by the end of a 30-minute play, that the child would be able to sing along to the little introductory song. So we would start off with a song, we would end with a song. And by the end of the session, they would be able to sing along. So if that child was not paying attention, they wouldn't be able to learn the melody and the words to the song, but their ability to process would have been hampered by having to sit still and pay attention. So a neurodiverse person may pay attention better when they're moving, self-regulating, and not maintaining eye contact. If your child is able to learn skills, they are able to pay attention without sitting still. So if they have words, if they can do tasks, if they've learned things at all throughout their lifetime, they're going to be able to pay attention. Just figure out what paying attention looks like for your child. And why is attention important if we've kind of just, thrown out this idea of sitting still and listening? Well, good attention and listening skills are really helpful for gaining and extending knowledge of the world and information, understanding language and routines, learning and using new words and developing speech sounds, and maintaining and enjoying interactions with others. So Teaching and sharing new communication skills can be challenging, so let's get creative and flexible when we're learning. No more sitting still at a little desk for an hour at a time. So when we talk about speech and language, we can break language up into two sections. There's receptive language and there's expressive language. And some children may struggle with one, most children struggle with both to some extent. Receptive language is the ability to understand communication, what's being said to us, what we read, words and language. A person with receptive language difficulties might seem to not listen when they're spoken to. They may show a lack of interest in conversations or stories. They might find it difficult to understand words and sentences. They could struggle to answer questions or follow instructions. There's no standard set of symptoms that indicates a person struggles with receptive language disorder. But if your child, I suppose, struggles to process information that you're saying to, if they don't seem to listen when you talk to them, they may be struggling with their receptive language. And then on the opposite of that, you have your expressive language disorders or difficulties. Expressive language is the ability to communicate and to convey meaning, words, and language. And a person who has expressive language difficulties might use a very limited vocabulary, which is shorter, simpler sentences. So they might say, he go work instead of he is going to work. They might have trouble finding the right word when they're speaking. They might use the wrong word in communication. So they might call all animals cats, no matter what the animal is. They will maybe rely on standard stock phrases in communication or repeat phrases that they hear frequently. So if you have a child that repeats phrases from a television or a song or something that they hear their parents saying, they may use those as standard phrases. It's nearly like a little comfort blanket that they can rely on. They might be unable to tell a story or communicate their point or go around in circles. So if you've ever asked your child, how was school today? And you get, good, like that child may have an expressive language difficulty, or they may not be interested in talking to you that day. They might struggle to start or hold a conversation with others, whether it's their peers or adults. They may not observe the general rule of social communication. So they may talk at you, but they're not observing to see if you're actually listening or interested. And they'll sometimes struggle with oral and written work when they're in school. So that's the expressive language. And, it's worth remembering not to panic. Any of these signs and symptoms are not indicative of a major disorder. Every child develops differently. There's no one size fits all. You may have a child that struggles with expressive language when they're younger, and then all of a sudden after a year, with no intervention or therapy, they come on in amazing, leaps and bounds. I've heard of so many stories of children that have a younger brother or sister that for some reason, their being around the younger child really promotes their language development. So, no child has perfect language and communication. There is no model child. So not to worry if you see some of these signs and symptoms. It's normally very straightforward. And it's the same with speech and pronunciation. There's actually a guide here to show kind of when you can expect pronunciation sounds to develop. But you'll notice that like the full pronunciation should not be fully developed up until the age of 7. And even then, it's fairly common to see children, even young adults, that may have unusual or different speech pronunciation, but there's nothing wrong with them intellectually. There's nothing wrong with them cognitively. They just pronounce things differently. So it shouldn't be an area of major concern, again, unless your child's quality of life is significantly impacted. So what I'm trying to say is, if your child pronounces words a little bit funny, if they use kind of out of phrase context, if they struggle to pick the right word, I wouldn't worry that much unless your child is significantly distressed, maybe in school, or they're not getting their point across at home or in the community. That's the point at which I would be kind of looking and say, okay, well, my child might need a bit of support here. And part of what a speech and language therapist does is supporting a child with their social skills development and their communication. Autistic children can often have difficulties with non-autistic social skills. So like I said before, they don't struggle when they are when they're communicating with other autistic people. They'll encounter a little bit of a challenge when they're communicating with non-autistic people. So what do we think of when we think of social skills? Well, for years, for decades, eye contact was the number one aim, the number one goal. But we now know through research and through the feedback of the autistic community that eye contact is not necessarily to social skills. And in fact, when we train eye contact or when we force eye contact, again, the child may be using their energies to focus on, okay, maintain eye contact. I am actually not listening to what you're saying. I can't think about what I'm going to say, but I know I have to maintain eye contact. That's the important thing. You know, we're teaching the child to focus on the wrong thing there. So if your child does not have great eye contact, I would not worry about it. And, you know, I've worked with loads of autistic kiddies that have brilliant eye contact. So, you know, it tends to be, people say it's a sign or a symptom of autism very frequently. But honestly, I've seen loads of kids who come in with a massive smile, lovely eye contact, and they communicate non-verbally. So I wouldn't worry too much about that if I were you. Facial expression, everyone's got different facial expressions. Sometimes autistic kids may not have, their facial expression might not necessarily show what's going on the inside. They could be really, really enjoying themselves, but they could look like they're absolutely, you know, terrified, or vice versa. But generally what you see is what you get, and you know your child, you know their signs when they're happy, when they're upset, when they're distressed. Body language. So when we think about social skills and body language, it gets kind of complex. You know, you're pointed, you're looking towards somebody. But when I talk about body language, what I mean is movement is good. Children like to wiggle, they like to jiggle, they like to move, they like to jump, and that will help them be able to make friends and have great social skills. So when we think again about maybe social skills for slightly older children, we're thinking about things like gesture, our tone of voice. How do we start, hold, and end a conversation? And not changing the subject of a conversation just so we can talk about our favorite things. So these are all areas that maybe older children and teenagers might be a bit more concerned with. Things like turn taking, understanding friendships and relationships, and then the ability to be flexible. So we will have heard that autistic people really, really like routine. They like things to be kind of structured. To which I say, you know, who doesn't like routine? Who doesn't like waking up in the morning and know what you're to have 10 meetings on that you didn't know about the day before? But the ability to be flexible and to respond appropriately to changes and disruption, that can be really useful when it comes to social skills, because things don't go as we planned when we're playing with others, and we need to be able to cope with that. So what does your child do to show that they're listening and understanding? And how do they show affection or interest in other people? So maybe they're really cuddly. Maybe they like to sing songs. Maybe they like to play with their toys beside somebody. Maybe they just like to be around them. They're not necessarily coming up and talking to them, but they're happy to be in the room with them. So what does social skills look like for your child? And how can you work with the raw material that you already have? Because we know that using a strengths-based approach is the best approach for our young people. So for the next part of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about strategies to support speech, language, and social development. And we'll talk probably mainly, we're not going to talk about specific things like, you know, how to work on pronunciation or swallowing and things like that, but we will look at strategies that are easy to implement at home throughout the day, part of your normal routine that you can do to promote communication. So first and foremost, look at your environment. So at the moment for all of us, that's going to be the home. And we're very, very limited, unfortunately, that our young people and our children can't be around their peers, can't be around people their same ages, their teachers, their SNAs, people in the community. So we are seeing that, you know, children are experiencing a little bit of a loss of opportunity to practice these social skills. And we hope that once things get back to normal, they'll have plenty of opportunities to interact with the people around them. So for the time being, our environment is our home. So we're going to do things like reduce distraction in the environment. So, you know, turning off the TV, turning down the sound of the music, maybe not having pets and people moving around. This doesn't mean that you need to put your dog out in the shed. What I mean is if you want to work on a specific skill, so say, for example, you want to teach your child some social skills or something like that, it's best to practice it in a nice quiet room where there's less distraction. But by no means turn your house into a clinic sterile environment. You don't have to do that. It's not natural. It won't replicate real life. I just mean if you identify skills that you want to work with that your child is particularly struggling on, maybe start by working in a nice quiet environment. So one of the best things you can do with your children is to play attention and listening games. It doesn't have to feel like therapy or intervention. So games like Simon Says is great for attention and listening. Really simple one that you can play with toddlers is just ready, steady, go, or traffic lights. So getting them to stop and go. You can use visuals or you can just use the verbal. And you're not teaching your children vocabulary about traffic lights. What you're teaching them is to listen and pay attention. And then there's things like Sounds Lotto, which is a lovely game where you can literally do it, get on YouTube, type in farm animal sounds, and you play the first one that comes up. Let's say it's a cow mooing, and you could say, that's a cow mooing. What else do we hear on a farm? And get the child to name sounds that they might hear on a farm, in the zoo, in the city, in the hospital. You can make it as simple or as complicated as you want it to be. And you don't actually even need like access to, YouTube or a phone. You can do it, just make the noises yourself. And sound bingo is a little bit like this, but it involves the use of a card. So you play the video, and when the child hears the noise, they mark it off in the card. I'll show an example of that in the next slide. So you can make it fun, and you're working on their attention, their listening skills, but you're also working on their communication and social skills by getting them involved and doing something together. But it's all done through a really fun, engaging activity. And going back to that creating the communication-friendly environment, call the child's name to get their attention before they speak. And I see this everywhere when it comes to communication, and I do believe that it is important. But I also see parents who wonder or who worry when they say, well, my child doesn't respond when I call their name. I could call their name over and over and over again, and I have to go up really close to get their attention. And yeah, that means that attention is something that that child may need to work on. But also we can meet them halfway. There are other ways we can gain attention without calling the child's name. We can do gestures, so wave, thumbs up, high five. And you'll know if the child comes up and gives you a high five that you've got their attention. Being playful is a great way to keep their attention. So sing songs, use a silly voice, use lots of silly voices, get down to their level, let them lead, play with their toys. These are ways to get their attention without calling their name over and over and over again. Or if you're really patient, you can just wait until the child is ready to engage with you. You could be waiting 45 minutes until they come over and show you something that they want to do with your interaction. Maintain attention by using gestures and pictures when asking questions and giving instructions. So we don't all have to be children's TV presenters, but a little bit of it can be helpful. So you can ask, can you get your hat and your scarf, and hold up pictures of both. This is particularly helpful for children who have issues with receptive language, so understanding what's being said to them. And give clear and explicit praise for active listening. So well done, Charlie, you're doing really great listening. I'm so proud of you. And at GAP, we always give praise for attempts, because we know that attempts can take as much effort and energy as successes. So this is on the right, we have examples of the sound bingo. So you'll see all the different types of sounds there are. You play a recording, so you can play it on a YouTube video. You can make your own if you're feeling particularly crafty and you want to punish yourself, but there are loads of sound cards, sound bingo cards available. Just type it into Google Images. And then fun interactive games like the banana song, which I'm not going to demonstrate now, but again, you can look it up on YouTube. So songs with actions that you can do with your child, particularly if they really enjoy music. So not only are they learning the language, the vocabulary, so in this song, the vocabulary is mainly about bananas, but they're learning actions, and they're learning the actions that go with the words. So they're learning to listen to what you say, process it, and be able to do it. And it's all taught really nicely through actions. And we have more games here. So Simon Says, I know when I'm playing Simon Says, I always struggle beyond the 5 most basic instructions. So here's a nice long list of activities for Simon Says. Something that you can play with really young children that's very, very simple is just repeat after me, copy me, pat your head, touch your nose, do this, you know, really, really simple things that can be quite exciting for little kids and toddlers. And yeah, like just, you can do it in a group, you can do it one-to-one, but make it fun and your child will stay engaged with you. And we spoke a little bit about having visual supports, and visual supports are so useful for children that struggle with both receptive and expressive language. I have never met a child that did not understand pictures of some way, shape or form. I've met children that can't read, that can't speak verbally, but they all understand pictures and they can use them to communicate and understand what's being communicated to them. So support your verbal language by using gestures, pictures, signs, and symbols. This helps children to develop their attention and listening, comprehension, and expressive language skills, particularly when we're trying to explain abstract concepts. And social skills are absolutely chock-a-block with abstract concepts that don't quite make sense to children. So when we say things like, oh, not long now till home time, we're not communicating anything to the child. We're adding more uncertainty to their lives. But if we were to use a visual, so a clock, a watch, or a timer, even a sand timer, that helps the child have a visual representation of what not long now means. I have worked with loads of children that say to me, okay, how long till whole time? And they want to know literally 10 minutes, 5 minutes. If you say 10 minutes, they know it means 10 minutes and they understand that. Where if you say just a few more minutes, it's not enough for them. They're still anxious, they're worried. Social skill of being flexible. We talked about that earlier. Being flexible and being able to deal with changes when they come up unplanned. That's a really great skill to have, but it's a tricky one to understand. And a nice way to understand being flexible is by using some wool, some pipe cleaners, and lollipop sticks. You'll see them up in the top right-hand corner here. So you can say to your child, have these 3 things in front of you, and you can say, we're going to learn today about being flexible with our friends or with our mom and dad. So sometimes things don't go to plan. And when they go to plan, if we're too stiff, like a lollipop stick, then bad things happen. We can snap under pressure and get upset. And if we're too loosey-goosey, like wool, nothing happens. But if we're flexible, like a pipe cleaner, then we can adapt or we can change our plans. So you can make it age appropriate to teach a child, but having an example like that to teach an abstract concept is really helpful. Another tricky abstract concept is taking turns. So using visuals can really help, because we know when we're working with young children, taking turns can be emotionally and cognitively challenging, and it often ends up in tantrums or meltdowns. So if we use visual cues, we use a timer, and if we have a fidget toy, that can really help a child with turn taking. So every time it's not their turn, they can use a fidget toy just to keep themselves occupied. So things like lists, maps, menus, YouTube tutorials, all of these are really, really helpful visuals that we can use to help our children learn. So a visual that you may have heard of is a picture story or a social story. So these are just little picture descriptions, and you can make them as complicated or as simple as you like. So if you have a child that's not yet at reading level, you can make it all pictures and you can talk through it with your child. These are really useful when you're planning for an event like, going to a new place, the doctor, the dentist, going to get my new shoes or my haircut, or maybe a situation. So, going to after school or playing with my friends, what is nice playing, what's not nice playing, and things like that. So you can make these individualized to your child. just by using pictures. And then some other really straightforward visual aids and supports are things like morning schedules, lists, first thens. First thens are the most basic form of schedule you can use with a child. And for the youngest child, the younger children, these are the most appropriate. So it's literally one activity first, and then we're going to do this one. So in the example here, we have first magnetic numbers and then ball bounces. But then as the child develops these sequencing skills, then they can have more complicated schedules like the one below or the morning schedule. And you know your schedule is really working when the child starts taking control over it and they start taking things off and putting their favorite activities on. And I've had parents say to me, you know, we use the schedule and it doesn't seem to work. So I do really encourage being consistent and taking practice. Keep modeling the behavior. You don't need to get the child by the hand and get them to do it, but get their attention to say, okay, first breakfast and then we brush our teeth. You know, just keep modeling until it becomes a part of their daily routine. And then you can encourage them to change the tokens or the symbols as they become interested. And like I said, once you see them going up and ripping off toothbrushing and putting up watch TV, then you know it's working and it's really effective. And then we've also talked about augmentative and alternative communication, so specialized devices for children that are pre-verbal or non-verbal. So on our far left, we have the picture exchange communication system. It's a book with little Velcroed pictures. And what I love about PECs, these picture books, is that everybody understands pictures. So whether they're with you at home communicating with this, or they're visiting Granny and Granda, or they're going to the shop, or they're ordering something in a restaurant, everyone who they hand these pictures to will understand what they're communicating. And you see the iPad app there as well. That's very like PECs, except it's on an iPad, and often they will have a type to speak function. So the iPad will verbalize what they're looking for. You'll see a very, very simple choice board there for a child who maybe isn't quite using PECs, but they can choose an activity that they want to do. And we also see people who use sign language, whether it's LOV, which is a simplified version of sign, or Irish Sign Language. And then again, here's some more examples of our daily schedules. You don't have to go and buy a daily schedule. If you have a laminator and a printer, you're good to go, and a bit of Velcro. You can make these as personal as you want them to be. And I always recommend that people actually take photos of the real life examples because it makes it more personal and more relevant to the child. So we're coming to the end now of our presentation. There's just a few more strategies that you can do to develop receptive and expressive language. So to help a child with their receptive language, and remember that's when a child struggles to understand what's being said to them or to process what's being said, you can use simple language, speak calmly and steady, so not too fast and not too slow. And really important, allow for processing time. A person may hear you and they might still need extra time to process and respond. An autistic child could need maybe 20, 30 seconds or even up to a minute to process something that's said to them or an instruction. So if you think your child's not listening to you, give them the benefit of the doubt and allow for that additional processing time. Don't overwhelm someone with questions and information. And this again tags on to that processing time. If we keep adding questions and information, the child has less time and ability to process. Use visual supports and model the language with gestures. And I always think of using visual supports, it frees up an area of the brain required for processing verbal language. If they see the picture, they understand immediately. And that frees up a little space in their brain that allows them to cope and to deal with the request that you just made. Practice makes perfect, become part of your daily routine. Model language, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by model language in the next slide, but just have conversations with and around your child, narrate what you're doing, talk to them, even if they're not responding, talk and interact with them, and I'm sure everyone does that already, and break down long instructions into smaller, more digestible chunks. So instead of saying, time to get ready for school, break it down into manageable tasks. And you can use your visual schedule with this as well. So can you get your bag and lunch? And you can use pictures with that as well. And put your juice in the bag and close it. So really simple, straightforward instructions. For some children who have real difficulty with receptive language, those two instructions together may be overwhelming. So start really small. Put your juice in the bag with a picture of juice in bag and model it as well. Now, how to develop expressive language. So what a person says, what they comment on, what they ask questions, tell stories, discussions and conversations. And I would say that most of the parents that I work with are most concerned about expressive language. So they're worried that their child has not yet developed verbal language. They're worried that their child has verbal language, but they're not using it socially or to communicate. So here's what we can do to help kids in this situation. Comment throughout play and everyday tasks. So I see you're putting your books away, you're tidying up your toys. You don't really like the taste of that spaghetti, do you? So just comment, make it natural, just a part of the everyday life. It doesn't have to feel like therapy or school or anything like that. Any language is going to help your child's development of language. Rephrase what the child has said without correction. And that's really important. When we go straight for the correction, sometimes what the child experiences is a punishment or a shame. And they might not even know why they feel ashamed, but they're feeling it. And the moment the child feels ashamed, they have switched off. They're not able to learn. So instead of saying, no, that's not right, this is how you do it. So the child might say, Sam box jump. And the parent could say, well, that's right, Sam jumped over the box. So model the correction, but don't be strict and forceful about the correction. Just say it the right way the second time. Repeat and add language. So you can be the leader and expand and model longer sentences. So the child might say, bear eat, and the parent might say, the bear's eating the porridge. So introduce new words and proper grammar, and also offer choices. Even a child who's pre-verbal, this is really good for their development. So at breakfast time, you could say, do you want a banana or an apple? And that encourages the child to communicate and engage with you, even if they're still pre-verbal, and it introduces them to new vocabulary. And part of the reason that everyone who says when you're using some kind of form of assisted alternative communication, whether it's pictures or an app, they always say to pair it with language. So if you're holding up, let's just say this is a picture of an apple. You could say, do you want an apple? So you don't just hand them the photo, you're saying, do you want an apple? And you're always pairing your visual aid with clear language. And something that we all, are concerned about and worry about as parents and carers is supporting social skills development. If I had €1 for every time a parent has come to me and says, I'm really worried about my child's social skills, I'd be a very, very wealthy person. And every time a parent says, I'm really worried about my child's social skills, I know what they actually mean is, I'm worried about my child's relationships and their quality of life. Will they get invited to birthday parties? Will they be bullied at school? Will they have relationships? Will they get married? So, I think social skills has quite a clinical connotation with it, and social skills has gotten a bad reputation over the last few years, as if we're trying to force autistic children to comply to non-autistic standards. But I know that when we worry about social skills, we worry about the child's life and what they're going to get out of life. So I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to support a child or a teenager to develop social skills, as long as the child wants that for themselves. So foster relationships with peers who share an interest or a hobby. So if we know one thing about autistic people is that they connect with people over their favorite interests, hobbies, activities, games. So if your child is really into music, get them involved in a musical group. If they love animation or history and sports, find their people and watch the magic happen. Facilitate social interaction with other children and adults. So they don't necessarily have to be their peers, but they can be cousins, uncles, aunts, granny and grandas. and model appropriate interaction. So we're always going to be modeling things like turn taking, sharing, and I see less and less of this in social skills instructions and courses. We need to model kindness and helping others and standing up for others, when they're being bullied and things like that, or if somebody says something mean to our friends, model what we actually want our child to say. Use positive language when we're teaching social skills. So instead of saying, don't grab, no grabbing, say, hand it nicely to Cathal, or that's lovely playing with your little brother, Play simple games where you take turns with your child, like building a tower with blocks or Jenga. Hide and seek can have turn taking, colouring, and if they're slightly older, board games or card games. So games like that can, help with social skills like turn taking and sharing. I've had a lot of parents say to me that their child struggles with winning and losing, so that if they lose a game, they can get very, very emotional. And my advice to them always is, losing is a part of life, and unfortunately your child is going to lose. So they need to develop that ability to regulate emotion. It's better for them to learn at home where they feel safe and supported and you are there to co-regulate with them than it is for them to learn when they're out amongst their peers and maybe not so feeling so secure or safe. So, games like that, even though it is fun and it can be just a part of relaxing, it does teach valuable lessons. And for children who struggle with sharing or turn taking, I always recommend use a less preferred activity or an item. So if they have a toy that they adore, that they don't want to be parted from, don't use that toy to teach turn taking. Use something that they're less mad about. And picture stories or other visuals explain social situations. They don't have to be printed. You can encourage your child to get involved and take ownership over them by getting them to draw or colour them. Our SLT, Sabrina, recommends that you kind of identify one social skill at a time and practice that and model the appropriate use of that social skill. So you might pick a tone of voice as to be a social skill. So you're modeling by using a happy, positive tone of voice when you're praising your child or talking to them, and encouraging them to listen to how their voice sounds and how your voice sounds. So pick one skill and focus on it. So that brings us to the end of this evening's session, and I hope you found it helpful and it's answered some questions that you might have. So next week we will be looking at week 4, sensory